Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Jay Ramirez, and my partner is Milagros QL, and we're going to talk to you about the direct method. Before we know what is the direct method, we must know what a method is. A method is the mixture of activities and actions that a professor must adapt to the students to produce effective knowledge. Not all the methods are going to work with the same group. The professor must diagnose the group to know which method is going to be effective with those students.
The direct method is a relevant change from grammar translation method. In the direct method, language is used as means of instruction and communication. It suggests that learners have to begin to study a second language as children do. That is, first learn to speak. And one of the intentions of this method is teach students how to use the language spontaneously. So one of the most important aspects is that students have to avoid the use of the native language and try to avoid translation techniques. In the teaching process, it required the use of the second language, and the learners have to use the language that they are trying to learn. As I already said, with this method, the students have to learn vocabulary and grammar while having a conversation. In other words, grammar is learned inductively, so an explicit grammar rule may never be given. And the main goal is that students have to learn how to think in a new language. So, in Zoom, language should be learned by associating an idea directly with the spoken word, not by translating or memorizing grammar rules.
Now I'm going to talk about some characteristics of this teaching method. Before the direct method, the professors only had the translation method to teach other languages, but since 1900, Francois Gouin tried to implement the direct method in his classes, being one of the pioneers of this method. The main characteristic of this teaching method is that it totally avoids the professor's and the student's mother tongue, because they must get used to always try to speak in English, to have a betterment in their pronunciation, and to get used to use that language in their daily life. Other characteristic of this teaching method is that it teaches by showing images or explaining meanings. This is because we don't have to translate what the students want us to say. This is because we must force the students to think in English, so that's going to have a betterment in their knowledge of the language. These methods emphasize on questions, answers, dictations, and imitation of what the professor says and does. This method looks that the students read and think in English and do not translate what they are reading. Now, my partner and I plan a lesson in which the direct method can be used. Okay, first, the topic is Meet My Family. The objective is describing simply his or her family, the members, where do they live, how old are the members, and who are the members. Okay, the contents are the members of my family and the family rules. Talking about the methodology, we're going to start with our warm up, that is 5 minutes. Okay, then the first activity is that the professor is going to put some images of the family. Each one of those are going to have a specific role. For example, the father stays at home and the mothers go to work and the teenagers stays at home studying. Okay, and the professor is going to describe the situation in that house and each one of the family members' roles. Now, the production activity is going to be that the students are going to draw his or her family in a paper, and then they must go to the board and they must describe many characteristics of them, like how are them, or what is their role in the house, etc. Each one of the students must do that. And to finish the wrap-up activity, that is going to be that the professor describes his own family and his own role in his family. And then the students must be able to ask any question that they have to for the lesson. And the assessment of the lesson is that if the student was able to describe his family and his members with some characteristics of them. In this methodology, the direct method is implicit because this method includes that the students doesn't have to speak any time in Spanish. Besides, they're going to push them creativity and they're going to imitate what the professor just did. In that way, the students are not going to speak in Spanish anytime and they're trying to express themselves in English in all the time of the lesson.
The use of this method in the activity that I already explained has some positive aspects in terms of feasibility. The first one refers that the direct method makes the English learning process more interesting and lively because professors use different instruments such as pictures. And learners have the chance to establish a connection between a word and its meaning. Secondly, the use of this method facilitates the learners and participation of students because they have a more active role in the process of learning. Now we have the third aspect, which is about the oral skill. For this method, learners develop in a proper way elements such as fluency of speech, good pronunciation, and power of expression. Due to the use of the direct method, the students are able to understand what they are learning, think about it, and then they can express their own ideas in correct English use. And next, we have an important element of this method and an important advantage. Conversation between teacher and learners is central to the lesson. So, almost 99% of the lesson is developed orally and in the second language. And finally, this method allows teachers and students to develop their own creativity in order to complement their oral speech. So as teachers use instruments such as pictures, storytelling techniques to present the contents, students also can use this kind of instruments to present their oral production. So this activity was thought to be developed in a classroom, and as we see, it could have several positive aspects, although due to the situation that we live in our country, it's almost impossible to develop this plan in a classroom. However, we consider that the direct method makes easier for teachers and students to implement different activities in a virtual class. It's easy to use this method in a virtual environment because the purpose is to develop oral skills, to have oral production, and professors can use or they can adapt activities in order to develop them in a virtual platforms. So, and the students have the possibility to improve elements such as pronunciation or learn vocabulary, and it could be equally effectively. Next, they are going to explain some other points about the activity that we already saw.
Some challenges of the implementation of these methods are that not all the students are going to be able to speak through all the lesson in English. Speaking a foreign language is something tiring, and the students might burn out for the exposure to that language. Another challenge for this method is that some vocabulary may be difficult for the students. If the professor says many words that the students don't understand, they are not going to know what to do or what to say in their lesson. In our context, some of us might be stuck with a concept or a word that we don't understand, so we don't know what the professor wants us to do. So that's a challenge that most of the students had, but with virtual classes we can search for those terms to make the question clear. Another challenge is that not all the students are going to be interested in paying attention and have the complete lesson. So they're going to speak in Spanish just because they're boring and they don't have the interest in speak all the lesson in English. Another important point is that some students have never received English classes and their first contact with English was like in high school or even the university. So if we start to speak them in English, they're going to get lost and they will not know what to do. Another challenge for the professor is that they must plan all the activities and these activities must fit with the group's English level. If we don't plan this, the students are not going to understand what we want them to do and the group might get lost. At the same time, the professor must be able to resolve any vocabulary doubt without translate. The professor must know all the terms that he's going to teach to explain them in a correct way to his students.
To finish with the presentation, we are going to review the most important elements of the direct method. The first one, the direct method, is a form of immersion method. In other words, language is taught by only hearing and communicating in the language that students are trying to learn. Second, this method pays its attention on language, specifically on oral and listening skills, instead of language structures and grammar rules. Then, the direct method has one very basic rule. Students don't have to translate, and students don't have to use their first or native language. And finally, the main goal is to teach students to think in a new language. So as a result, they will have a good pronunciation and a good oral production. Thank you.